Welcome. In this presentation, I would like to talk about how you can structure your academic text. And we will talk about structuring at different levels. So on the one hand, we will talk about structuring of the entire document and subdividing it into chapters. But also at the more finer level, we talk about how do you structure actually an abstract as well as the introductory chapter. When we talk about the document as a whole, we can think of the structure as the different headings that we have. And you would start, if it's like a thesis, a dissertation, or a paper that you're writing, you would start with a title. And then depending on what type of work it is, you might, but also maybe you don't, include a declaration. For example, that this was your own work. You might, but often you don't need to, you include acknowledgements. Then what is typically included is an abstract. And then for dissertations and theses, you often include a list of contents, potentially a list of figures and tables if you have many of them, and potentially a list of abbreviations also if you have many of them. And then the main body of your work starts with an introduction. It introduces the topic, and then that is followed on by literature review, description of your approach and methods, then your results. Afterwards, you discuss the implication of your results in the discussion chapter, and then you conclude about your findings. And in the end, you have the list of references, and you might have one appendix or several appendices. So this is the broad structure. And if you look into the content of kind of those main chapters, kind of you have your abstract or executive summary, depending on what it is. That should be kind of just a summary that is clear and concise. And we will go into that in more depth later. You have your introductory chapter, where you introduce your work, you motivate it, you define also what the aims and objectives of your study are, you define the scope and the limitations. And towards the end of the introduction, you provide an overview of the structure of the rest of your document. In your literature review, you kind of provide the context to your study, what has been done before. And there, it's important that you tell a story. So, for example, you can go from the broader context, more and more narrow, to the very specific context of your study. You could also tell the story more in a historical way, or maybe you tell the story in the sense that there are different positions and you explain these in the literature. It's very important that you critically analyze the relevant literature, not just present, oh, the authors found this, those found that, but you critically analyze what they find and also take into consideration their methods and the validity of their studies. And very importantly, towards the end, you identify the gaps in the current literature and the current knowledge, because that really motivates what you were doing then. How you do this is what you describe in the methods chapter. So you might start with an overall and broad discussion of your approach, kind of telling the reader where you are coming from, and then you go to explain the methods in more detail. So what are you doing? How are you going to do it? What are the limitations of those methods? And if you have case studies, for example, what are those? And you describe the context. What we really would like to know in your methods section is, on the one hand, what was your approach to collecting data? What are your data collection methods? Then what is your data, and what are your methods for data analysis? After that, you move to the results and you present these. And here you also respond to your research objectives, and you present and interpret the results critically. And after that, in your discussion section, it's like making a step back, and you discuss the findings and their implications. So you ask yourself, what do these findings actually mean in the wider context? And therefore, you also relate them to this context and to the literature, right? So here you relate back to the literature that you discussed in your literature chapter, and you then really present and ask yourself to what extent you kind of improved on or kind of found something different, but also maybe something similar that other people have found before. And in the last chapter, you conclude. The conclusion usually starts with a summary of your study and your main insights. You might discuss the limitations, but not just list what the limitations are. It's also important to then reflect on what is the impact of these limitations on the interpretation of your results and of your study and of on the insights. And you will very likely highlight further of future work. So those are the core chapters. Just one tip I suggest, kind of why this structure is really nice and it's a very standardized structure. When you name your headings, it should be clear that something is a literature review or methods section, but don't just call them literature review methods, because then we don't even know, is it a study in biology or is it a study discussing human resources, right? So add a little bit more so that we understand what type of literature you are discussing, right? So for example, summary of the literature in such and such a theme, or you specify the methods that you are describing. Good. From there, let's move to the structure of the abstract. You can think about it as writing one sentence each on different topics, and you would start with one sentence that motivates your study. Why is it important? Why should somebody be interested? Why are we studying this? And then in your second sentence, very briefly and very high level, you summarize all the existing research on this topic, and you define a research gap. Afterwards, you present very briefly the purpose or the aim of your study, and after that, the methods that you are using. But again, it's very high level. We just want to understand, for example, whether it's a modeling study or a qualitative study, for example. And here you might also kind of mention limitations related to the purpose or related to the methods. But again, very high level. Then in one sentence, you present the results, and in your final sentence or two, the implications and the contributions of your work to the wider body of literature and to knowledge. And when we move from the abstract to the structure of the introduction, we see a lot of similarities, except that what was a sentence in the abstract is often a short paragraph in your introductory chapter. So again, you start with the motivation of the study. Why is it important? Why should we care? Then you have a paragraph that summarizes existing research on the topic, and importantly, towards the end of that paragraph, clearly defines your research gap. Then you describe the purpose or the aim of your study. You might also, depending on how long the abstract can be, you can also go a bit more into detail, where you have kind of the aim first as a broad aim, and then you have more detailed objectives. Afterwards, you have just in, let's say, 2 sentences or so, a description of your methods, of your approach. And then you skip the results. Also, you don't write much about the implications, but you might also add 1 or 2 sentences still on the contribution of your work to the wider literature. And towards the end, you then describe again in 1 or 2 sentences the structure of your thesis or dissertation or paper, so that readers can understand what is coming next. So those were the different types of structuring that you do at a high level, but also at the more detailed level. And I wish you good luck with your writing projects.